Perry Miller called 1836 the Annus Mirabilis, and that means the miraculous year, simply because although the makings of the Transcendentalist movement really started coming about in the early 1830s, especially when Emerson essentially leaves the ministry in 1832 and begins writing and lecturing, occasionally guest preaching, but that's about it. Some of the other writers or figures or thinkers associated with the Transcendentalist movement are sort of getting their careers going in the early 1830s, but it's 1836 that is the really pivotal year. Number one, it's the first meeting of a group of people called the Transcendental Club. Now, this is not a club with like a president and they didn't have dues and take memberships. It was basically just a conversation group that sort of was very, very informal. And it was started by a fellow named Frederick Henry Hedge, a Unitarian minister. And at one time it was called Hedge's Club, but it met for the first time in September of 1836 because they said, you know, we're about to go to the celebration of Harvard's bicentennial. They had a big celebration in 1836 to mark the 200th anniversary of the founding of Harvard University in 1636. So they had a big festival and all this kinds of speakers and all these kinds of things. And afterwards, Frederick Henry Hedge, the Unitarian minister, obviously a Harvard grad, invited all these people over to begin having conversations at his home and dinner and these kinds of things. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was obviously invited, and they were close friends. And a number of different people from different lines of work, by the way, not just a bunch of ministers, although many of them were ministers, got together and began conversations over at Hedge's house. And this is the very first Transcendental Club meeting. There were many others following that. Eventually the club kind of petered out. But it also is very important because this began to be this kind of networking opportunity for writers and thinkers and artists to meet each other, get inspired by each other's thoughts, encourage each other to go out and write things. They would read each other's works, and it became a kind of intellectual melting pot, if you will. People would find out, hey, so-and-so wrote a new book, let's read it, let's talk about it. That would inspire somebody else to go and write something else. They would be able to update each other on the progress of their publications and their writings and these kinds of things. They would share news from abroad. It just began a wonderful opportunity for some of the leading intellectuals and writers of the area to get a chance to get together. And really not much like this existed in the Boston area prior to this. And as a result, also in 1836, a number of really important works, most of that you never even heard of, I understand, but Bronson Alcott, father of Louisa May Alcott, published Conversations with Children on the Gospels. We're going to look at that later on. Very important work. Very radical and controversial work. He ran a school, and this is essentially an experiment that he conducted with some of the teachers and students there on reading the Gospels to children and getting their honest feedback. You know how honest children can be about things. And publishing just direct transcripts of students' thoughts on the Gospels. A very radical thing to do. Got him in a little hot water, to be honest. William Henry Furness, a great writer, not very well known, publishes a very good work on theology called Remarks. And George Ripley, also a Unitarian minister for a while anyway, publishes Discourses on Philosophy. These are two works that probably haven't gotten a lot of attention, but they do demonstrate the depth of thought that's going on in terms of philosophy and theology among this more radical group of Unitarians or former Unitarians that are now beginning to call themselves Transcendentalists. It shows a sort of coming of age. These guys are really getting serious about probing the deeper questions of life, of culture, society, art, all of these things. But the biggest event, of course, of 1836 is the publication of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Nature, which is going to be the subject of the remainder of this lecture. Emerson had left the ministry shortly after the death of his wife, Ellen. He traveled to England and conceived of writing the work when he was on his way back. Ellen dies in 31, and he begins to sort of lose interest in being a minister. Eventually he begins to refuse to offer the Lord's Supper or communion, which troubles his colleagues who are more mainstream Unitarians, and begins also to become critical of the discussion of miracles in the Bible, something that the Unitarians held on to. Mainstream Unitarians held on to a belief in the miracle. circles, and Emerson begins to say, no, they're an aberration. So he begins to have some disagreements with them and decides eventually to leave the ministry. Fortunately for him, when his wife died, she left him quite a bit of money, so he could embark now on a career of writing and lecturing without having to worry too much about earning a living, though he was never a terribly wealthy man. According to Lawrence Buell, Emerson is perhaps the single most influential figure in American literary history, and this book is a big reason why. Perry Miller called 1836 the Annus Mirabilis.